Do I actually need it? I'm all right as I am I? Okay, fine. Thank you very much. I'm Katie Gardner. I'm at LSE. Thank you very much for inviting me to this really interesting Anthropology in London Day and to give a little micro lecture on anthropology and global shifts. So this will take probably about 5 or 10 minutes. So I hope that's not too much time and also not too short. So the panels and papers that follow are an exciting taste of new anthropological research on a range of important themes. Some of these have been explored within the discipline for generations, albeit with slightly different framings. Ethnic politics, social exclusion, political struggle, for example, seem to arise from the panels and from looking through what the paper is going to involve. Others, however, seem to be very much new kids on the block. Climate change and post-Trump social realities were not even recognisable as phrases, let alone sites of ethnographic engagement, back when I was doing my PhD. So all of the panels, however, seem to speak in some way to the conference theme of global shifts. And that's what I'm going to very briefly describe. So what I'm going to firstly do is scope out what some of these shifts might involve and what we actually might be talking about when we're talking about global shifts. And then, like Rebecca, I'm going to be deliberately provocative and pose some questions about the role and remit of anthropology and our possible response to so-called global shifts. So firstly, when I first was asked to do this, I thought, global shifts. And I wrote a list of what I thought the global shifts might be. Now, of course, you're probably all going to add other things to my list. And maybe list making isn't actually what I should be doing. But I'm going to read you out my list, and then I'm going to deconstruct my list or problematize it. So the first thing that sprung to mind was the Anthropocene. The shift into an environment dominated by human activity and its consequences. Pollution, waste and dirt, Pacific islands covered in rubbish, resource extraction and materialities, cityscapes and urban living, climate change and the consequences on local environments and livelihoods, changing imaginaries of the environment. So there's that. Second shift, changes to the nature of global capitalism. The rise of macroeconomic discourses which prioritise the market, the spread of corporate capitalism, land grab and dispossession, urbanisation and agrarian transitions, gig economies and their neoliberal logics, understanding the contemporary nature of capitalism, speculation and austerity, escalating inequality on global as well as local scales. Third shift, although for obvious reasons I might have got this shift wrong. And this shift actually, the fact that I might have got it wrong makes me worry about my whole list. So number 3, the shift to the right. I wrote this about 3 weeks ago. An apparent rejection an apparent rejection of liberal ethics of globalization towards a retrenchment of nationalism, borders and exclusions, Trump and Brexit, racism and a new politics of nostalgia. Or then again, maybe not. Number 4, new forms of conflict, activism and social movements. All of these are associated with numbers 1, 2 and 3 of my list. This includes activism and social movements on the right as well as the left, religious revivalism, indigenous social movements, humanitarianism and philanthropy, plus the politics of terror. Number 6, shifting bodies and the dissolving of binary gender categories. Gender fluidity, trans as a bodily and identity project, a new theoretical stance and a political movement. Body-machine interfaces via robotics and prosthetics. Bodies as art and material objects. Number 7, virtual realities. The increasing centrality of social media, gaming, cyborgs and avatars, online communities and relationships, the dissolving of material or bodily realities into virtual ones. Okay, so those are the themes the global shifts that came to me as I sat and kind of jotted them down. Not surprisingly, some of these themes are reflected in the papers today, several of them, many of them. As anthropologists, we're tasked with describing and analysing the world around us. Rather than building static models as our predecessors did in the mid-20th century, we're much more likely to take change for granted and push ourselves in our work and in our theorising to connect local with global scales of analysis, to situate our ethnography historically and be alive to political and economic contexts. Most of us here, I think, would agree that the discipline has an ethical obligation to use our findings to problem solving, to engage with the global issues and problems at whatever scale, and to contribute to public debates. So the papers today can be seen, I think they can be seen as barometers of the state of anthropology, and very vibrant, engaged, and relevant it seems. However, the danger of a list, such as the one I've just produced, is that it can read like a shopping list of the latest fad. So in the spirit of provocation, I wish to ask the following questions arising from this conference theme of global shifts. Actually, I'm not sure if these are, I've got 3 questions, but they kind of all run into each other, so this is just a bit of kind of, oh, now I've lost my document. Hang on a sec. Firstly, to what extent should anthropological agendas, our research agendas, our PhD agendas, and the ones that we carry on into our careers, to what extent should they be determined by current affairs? The danger is that in seeking to be relevant or have impact, we prioritise the fashionable and newsworthy over the more profound and theoretically meaningful, rushing to document the latest global shift, as in my list. The problem with shifts is that they are by nature unstable, so we're in danger of finding the ground beneath our feet is less than solid. Obviously, last week's election result in Britain shows the shift towards a right-wing nationalist agenda exemplified by Brexit. I was kind of, this time last year, June the 23rd, tearing up my hair, weeping and saying, everything's going down the drains, it's the end of the left, you know, oh my God. Suddenly it seems as if maybe that was wrong. Maybe we're not just all shifting to the right, maybe we're going to shift back to the left. Maybe that was just a moment in a period of political uncertainty. How much time is needed to pass before one can identify a decisive shift? The danger of fitting research around current preoccupations is exacerbated by research funding, determined as it is by funding council or donor agendas. So, for example, in terms of thinking about getting funding, the Global Challenges agenda, which is currently dominating funding, the funding agenda of the ESRC and the AHRC, funds that we might be getting as anthropologists, involves 3 main issues. Number 1, equitable access to sustainable development. Number 2, sustainable economies and societies. Number 3, human rights, good governance and social justice. Now, each of these themes arise from a particular discourse. I work in, not wholly, but I work partly in the anthropology of development. And immediately, I see terms like sustainable, good governance, and social justice, and I want to deconstruct that. So they arise from particular discourses with taken for granted assumptions and hidden transcripts, which we actually might have some very interesting things to say about where we're not writing grant proposals trying to follow their rubric. So my point here isn't just to kind of attack the global challenges agenda, which I don't want to attack. Really, it's to say that by focusing on global shifts, we might unconsciously and uncritically accept taken for granted discourses which have been predetermined by government agencies, news media, and so on. Worse, we neglect other issues which have failed to make it onto media and state agendas or have fallen out of favour. What about the shifts that we don't see? So, number 2 question. In focusing upon global shifts that we've pre-identified, or I've rather arrogantly pre-identified, are we in danger of ethnocentrism? As anthropologists, I swear, our remit is to start with the ontologies of those with whom we're doing field work. We therefore need to question whether or not our interlocutors identify with the issues on my list as important to their lives. Whilst in many cases the answer could well be yes, in others the answer is likely to be not at all. Therefore, we need to be careful as ever to start with the emic and not the etic perspective. How do our interlocutors see the world? Do they identify global shifts or something else? Indeed, and kind of more interestingly and profoundly, how do they think about time and its relationship to global and local scales? Is my list of global shifts yet more ethnocentrism, assuming particular models of interconnectedness, change in time, and importing my own metropolitan preoccupations and concerns? And number 3, maybe even more interesting and important, what about global or indeed social or cultural continuities rather than shifts? In focusing too much upon what has changed or seems to be changing, are we in danger of missing out on what hasn't changed? Some of the themes covered today are remarkable not in their newness, but in how long they've been around. Ethics and morality, the politics of difference, art and representation, work, labour, livelihoods, belonging and locality aren't new themes in the discipline. They're not. They're actually core to the discipline. And more importantly, they're actually not new themes or new things in human experience. These are things, and that's why the papers that are being given today pick up on them. They've been described and analysed and indeed experienced for generations. So this isn't a criticism of the conference, but really more a call for us to reflect on what stays the same and why things stay the same, or why what we're seeing is iterations, changing iterations of basically the same themes. So, and that returns us back to the other core anthropological question, which is really what we have in common, as well as what's different, not just in space, but also across time. Okay. Don't have do I give you this?
Well, hello. My name's Rebecca Remsen, and I'm due to give birth very soon, so I'm going to sit down and give my talk. Well, I'm really glad Katie and I had the chance to actually exchange our papers beforehand, and they speak a lot to each other, so we're picking up on similar themes. But thank you very much for making it here this morning, very early, and also thank you to Stephanie and Adam for inviting me to speak today at what promises to be a really stimulating and exciting conference. Now, thinking about the title of this conference, I was struck that the pairing of anthropology with global shifts was a kind of provocation on 2 fronts, so slightly different from yours, but 2 provocations that I'm going to pick up on. And the firstly, I think the pair raises questions about the nature of anthropological study and how it might be determined or shaped. So that's similar to Katie's point, I think. At the same time, it also raises questions about scale and the measurement of social change more generally. So what counts as a shift, and what boundaries are being transcended for things to seem to be changing? How can we account for change? Now, on both of these counts, I was reminded of Salin's very pithy comment that identifying cultural continuity is not the same thing as immobility, conservatism, or backwardness. In fact, he argues somewhat counterintuitively that the strongest continuity may actually consist in the logic of cultural or global change. So attending to shifts, be those global shifts or within anthropology as a discipline, may in many ways be what we as anthropologists have always studied. It's a kind of continuity that we perceive as change within the discipline. So maybe thinking about global shifts or shifts more generally is not such a new thing. Okay, so I want to think about the first provocation. We're all familiar with the idea that global shifts can become what I think of as kind of descriptive explanations for activities taking place in diverse settings, both in our anthropological descriptions and elsewhere. So this is what England and Leach have referred to as a sort of overarching meta-narrative or explanatory framework that comes to dominate much of anthropology. So, for example, poverty and marginalization are explained as an outcome of neoliberal austerity practices. The rise in sovereign and personal debt is attributed to fluctuations in global commodity supercycles. Environmental and economic precarity is due to the structural inequalities of capitalism. And as Joel Robbins has highlighted, subjects, it seems, can be understood to suffer in the same way everywhere. So these are kind of overarching frameworks of analysis that we give to our ethnographies. Homogeneous explanations are brought to bear on diverse ethnographic settings. Well, as anthropologists, we know that these kind of explanations require a certain top-down analysis, and they attempt to see links and connections across scales rather than attend to the particularity of experiences, enactments, and places. Indeed, we're often called upon to make these kind of connections to explain the so-called reason behind certain shifts and changes, from the increasing use of social media to the rise of nationalist movements around the world. When we're speaking about the so-called relevance of our work to funding bodies or across disciplines or in relation to public policy. Now, in making these connections, we also know that they're often not the ones that our interlocutors themselves are making to make sense of the world around them. So, for example, the cutting of social security in the UK is linked to wider austerity, often linked to wider austerity measures, but people's everyday experiences of accessing social security and the implications this has for household budgets is what people themselves are attending to. So given this kind of conundrum, how should we as anthropologists navigate these scales and forms of explanation? What's the role of anthropology to document and show these connections, and whose narratives become dominant in these explanations? What's the role of anthropology to follow these shifts, and if so, how? So it seems to me that how we choose to pitch our explanations and the connections we choose to make is always an inherently ethical act that brings certain worlds into focus over others. Now, the danger of explaining ethnographic diversity in terms of global shifts is what Gibson and Graham, the social geographers, using Geertz's term, have called the danger of using thin description. In contrast, they argue that a commitment to thick description might resist the gravitational pull towards forms of explanation that assume a kind of overarching, unidirectional theories of global change. Paying attention to heterogeneity and diversity within wider global shifts, then, such as those highlighted by Professor Gardner, become a way to challenge the idea that we actually know what these global shifts are. So we shouldn't assume that we know what they are. The point here would be to show how the very diversity that we can show in our ethnographies comes to work recursively, shaping the global shifts that we thought were familiar in the first place. Now, a case in point I want to draw attention to might be the way in which the mortgage market in Mongolia is being shaped and determined. And this is something being studied by a colleague of mine who works on our ESRC-funded project here at UCL called Rebecca Pluknem. And she asks if forms of financialization, such as private mortgages, in fact create homogeneous outcomes, or in fact, if they open up different responses and experiences. So unlike the UK and America, who often have multilateral companies and countries investing in their mortgage securities, Mongolian mortgages can't attract this kind of investment and are forced to be part of a kind of closed network of financial institutions who buy back and forth mortgage debt from each other. And one of the only ways that this system is sustainable, she's shown, is through mobilizing the interest that's earned on the mortgages being issued to the public. And this is brought back by the Central Bank of Mongolia, who reissue this debt in the form of pension funds. So in short, the pension funds of Mongolia are dependent on people buying houses and regularly paying back their mortgages. Now, the reason I want to draw attention to this example is that it's a very clear example of where forms of financialization might look the same as elsewhere. There might be said to be a rise in mortgage markets globally, but if we actually pay attention to the management of mortgage debt, we see that it's implemented and being used very differently in different settings. So to highlight this kind of heterogeneity is to draw attention to the ways in which wider shifts and processes are being experienced and made differently. So global shifts clearly don't simply create homogeneity. They can be shaped through local projects that come to determine wider global trends, providing critique of them, and creating forms of experimentation and change. So this is the idea that we actually need to use our ethnography to work back recursively to rethink what these shifts are. And this leads me to my second provocation, that the pairing of anthropology with global shifts raises questions about scale and the measurement of social change. So specifically here, I thought I'd draw attention to the fact that the measurement by which one might assume global shifts are occurring might not actually be determined by national boundaries as their unit of analysis. With changes in forms of sovereign power around the world, it's clear that the boundaries of what hold these things in place, or equally allow for their fluidity and movement, are now determined by other kinds of relationships and forms of power. International trade networks, for example, cut across these kind of sovereign boundaries, determining global flows of knowledge, ideas, information, even bacteria or germs and forms of pollution. And these flows are often highly unregulated, but they very much come to determine the worlds that we live in. And they're also extremely unequal, determining persistent winners and losers and maintaining forms of environmental and economic inequality around the world. So as anthropologists, how do we know how to trace these flows across territories and scales is often quite disorientating, leaving us often with a sense that things can't be fully known or anticipated. And navigating these senses of volatility and flux also leads to speculations as to how things are in fact connected or determined. I think that in attending to these forms of speculation, as they're being made by our interlocutors, we may actually attend to the kinds of lifeways, decisions, and ethical projects that are being made within such movements, and to the types of explanations that give rise to these. So put simply, global shifts may not always consist of the things that we think of. They might in fact resist specific forms of specification. And through attending to the ways in which people themselves engage with and come to understand these global shifts, we may in fact reveal connections and possibilities that we've yet to notice or assume to be the case. Well, I think many of the papers I've read through briefly, your abstracts today, do address some of these points. I'm just going to very briefly summarize the 7 panels. There's still 7 panels.
Yeah.
We're going to expect to hear presentations on the role of different ethical projects in global religious organizations, the negotiation of difference, biopolitical, artistic, or otherwise, in the face of global shifts, and questions surrounding access to and the migration of labor, and the politics of belonging and locality, as you mentioned. Some of these themes seem to be quite core to the discipline, but they're being approached in sort of slanted different ways. And there's going to be a roundtable discussion where they're going to return to the overall conference theme and provide a kind of overview of the major themes that's been raised. Now, I hope that these brief points that Katie and I have made today will provide some kind of stimulus to think with throughout the day, and these provocations will probably return to them in different ways. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a very stimulating day.
Thank you very much. First, I should apologise. I did a tremendously poor job of accessing you and your work, so I'm sorry for that. But I think that it's a plenary session, so do think of questions, but maybe I could just start off some conversation. I was very intrigued by the contrast between the two presentations. I mean, this conference is partly quite open, and in a way, often what comes out of it is a better idea of what the questions are. And in a sense, I was interested in sort of reversing your two presentations. So Rebecca, you talked about the sort of uniform logics that a lot of anthropologists and social scientists in general try to come up with to explain and account for things. Katie, you talked a lot about the list and the shopping list, and I was fascinated by the notion of the list, and it reminded me of there's a piece in a book by Nina Wakeford and Celia Lurie down at Goldsmiths about different inventive methods, which includes a chapter on the list. And the list in history has always been It's got a long, long history of centuries, and it's often used in a very speculative way. So you sort of start off making a list which is puts you in a passive mode, an observational list, and you start listing like 1, 2, 3, 4, and at some point you realise that the end point has diverged from the beginning, and you're no longer on the same point, but it's a tremendous way to make kind of intuitive connections between one thing and another that are often quite meandering, and it's a method which moves from the inside outwards, until you're sort of so it's a method which is very appropriate for a discipline that's sort of coherent, but which is also speculating. And I wondered whether, this is kind of a question for both of you, do you feel that at this moment in time that methodologically the kinds of approach that anthropology should take should involve sort of slightly different kinds of methods, slightly more speculative methods, not methods that account for? Or are we responding to what's going on at the moment with like our core set of skills that we've used for many years? And there was a slight difference in your presentations in that sense.
Well, I think the list isn't necessarily. I think the list can be a list that comes from the outside. The list is often the list of the funding call. For example, the list is something that might be out there in a way, almost in the kind of media. So my list was pulled out of my imagination, I guess. But also, there is a list within every curriculum which returns to kind of usually much more core themes within the discipline, religion, politics, etc. In terms of methods, I think that we've been using new methods for quite a long time. I mean, in terms of thinking about scales and territories, we've been thinking and working in we have multi-sided ethnography. I don't know how many people in this room have conducted multi-sided ethnography, but that now is no longer a particularly new thing. We have a lot of ethnography that does try and trace the links across scales and territories. Some of the most exciting work, for example, Remsen's work, the idea of friction. I mean, again, that's not that new anymore. So I don't know if we have. I think we always have the intention to engage in debates and methods and ways of seeing beyond the discipline. Whether we do that successfully or not, I don't know. Maybe people in this room will be able to carry it out further and do more with that. I'm not sure, in answer to your question about new methods, new ways of seeing.
I think I quite like the idea of the list of the people you might work with. I think it's. I agree with Katie's point that we're often called upon to explain the relevance of our work to different audiences, not just to funding bodies, also to our interlocutors and to across disciplines and so on. And often when we do that, we scale up our analysis sort of almost unconsciously and link it to global debates in a way that I think we don't have. We shouldn't have to do that kind of convertibility all the time. I think we should find a way to be able to talk about ethnographic specificity as challenging assumptions about what is of global relevance and importance. And the only way to do that is to use your interlocutors' explanations themselves to mobilise them as theoretical resources that we can use to challenge these things.
I particularly liked the point you made about the ways in which anthropologists can actually take these meta-narratives. And I think even, the idea of the global shift is a meta-narrative, clearly. Take these meta-narratives and through the fieldwork and through the perspectives of our informants, show how these things such as neoliberalism, global capitalism, corporations are actually framed in different ways in different locations. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that we can do at the moment. There's some very exciting work being done, as you mentioned, around the way that capitalism works right now, not just as a top-down thing that comes from above, but is actually generated by within different ethnographic contexts.
And I think methodologically that requires, it's very easy to scale up, to link things constantly, because as positions as we are in a global capital, in the centre of so much political discourse, we think that kind of can dominate our forms of explanation, but we need to be able to step outside of it as well and kind of see that these are very easy explanations for accounting for why things are the way they were in the world.
Another kind of question that occurs to me is the relationship between global shifts out there in the globe and global shifts out there within anthropology, not just in London, but across the world as well. And that might be an interesting thing to reflect upon. Does the work that we're looking at today, does the work that is being done by new researchers, by PhDs and people at the beginnings of their careers and ethnographers, does it reflect a big shift within anthropology or not? Or are we actually still working on the same basic themes that different generations have worked upon? And does that matter?
I think that links to just that point that you made earlier about the way in which so much of our research is ongoing now, because it's not confined to the specificity of location or place. And I think social media, especially in the project that I'm running at the moment here at UCL, we're constantly communicating with our interlocutors through forms of social media, and it kind of opens it up so that several of the questions that or the kind of methods by which we carry out fieldwork may have changed, but the questions very much are remaining the same.
Maybe we can throw that back to the audience. The other